I want to welcome everyone to tonight, and especially a thank you to Christina Richter, who's going to be talking about the Golden Spike, Roseville, and the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a presentation through the Renaissance Society of Sacramento, but it's part of our Talk series, and we have a lot of partners that are involved in these history talks, including the Sacramento River Delta Historical Society. Bill George is here. We hope the Sacramento Historical Society, Conference of California Historical Society, etc. Christina has very nicely offered to do 3 different talks for us. She was with the Placer County Historical Advisory Board. She's been giving talks on things like the Golden Spike quite often. And as you can tell, she also serves on the board of the Sacramento Historical Society, Conference of California Historical Societies, and others. I'm going to let her introduce herself. One last little bit of advice, and that is that you view this in speaker view so that you can really concentrate on her. So Christina, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mary Ellen, and thank you to the Renaissance Society. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here, and I welcome everyone. And as Mary Ellen was saying, at the end, if we can have questions, that would be great. And I also love to hear stories of the railroad, stories of maybe some ancestors that you have. Those always make our presentations more rich in the long term. So how I got into history is about 10 years ago. I was charged with writing a book about a local pioneer family, and I published that book in 2013. It went into 2 printings, and what it did is it really whet my appetite for local history. At the time, I was finishing up raising children and launching them, and the past 5 or 6 years, I've really been able to dig into local history and get to know everything about it that I possibly can, and I love talking about history. So again, here we go. Let me see if I can do this. Uh-oh, I'm having trouble with my, oh my goodness, I dislike these sorts of things. Okay, Mary Ellen?
Your arrows are working, they should work now.
There it is. Okay, thank you. Got it. All right, so for those of you who might be outside of the area, where is Roseville? So Roseville is just north of Sacramento. And of course, we are northeast of San Francisco. How we fit into the entire transcontinental map is a little bit different. So Roseville is about right here. And of course, the Transcontinental Railroad started in Sacramento. And we were a part of it in Roseville, but not a particularly large part until later. Just like so many small towns along this route here, this transcontinental route, things grew, they expanded, and that's why I love the story of Roseville. But first, let's talk about then and now. Roseville 1864 was about 200 people, and that's probably generous. Our main products were agriculture, and that involved produce, it involved sheep, cattle, etc. Our largest town was Auburn, and Roseville incorporated in 1909. Here in 2021, we're looking at 140,000 residents. So what is that, about 157 years later? And now we are the largest city in the county. In the very, very beginning of railroad history in the United States, we had what was called the Tom Thumb. And I don't know if anybody had a Tom Thumb as a child, especially young boys. They loved the railroad cars. And I know my brother had one called the Tom Thumb. And it was the first American-built steam locomotive to be actually operated on a common carrier railroad. And it was 13 miles long, and it opened in 1830. And at that point in time, thousands of miles of track were being contemplated to be built across the United States. And there was a lot of proposals presented to Congress to actually build a transcontinental railroad. But people were pretty skeptical. No surprise there, right? One of a school board member issued a statement, a very strong statement, that such things as railroads and telegraphs are impossibilities and rank infidelity. So interesting that things are the same, things are different, things are the same. Back here in California, we were looking at our first railroad, and it was the first railroad west of the Mississippi River. It was called the Sacramento Valley Railroad, and two people were instrumental in this. This is Charles Lincoln Wilson, and he was the first president of our first railroad, and he had hired an engineer by the name of Theodore Judah. And Theodore Judah ended up playing an instrumental part in the Transcontinental Railroad, as I'm sure the majority of you know. The Sacramento Valley Railroad Company was founded in 1852. The first rails were laid in 1855. It was completed in 1856. And this was the little route that it went. It went from Sacramento to Folsom, and it was a glorious time. They called it Negro Bar, and now it's Folsom. And at that point in time, Joseph Libby Folsom became the second president of the Sacramento Valley Railroad. The railroad was actually purchased from the Liedesdorf estate for $75,000. And Judah was hired to lay this railroad out. And the eventual lines, of course, went from Sacramento to Junction, which was Grider's Ranch, which turned into Roseville. And it was going to go on its way to Lincoln. All right, so that was a quick summary of the Sacramento Valley Railroad, which was the impetus for the rest of the line. Judah is determined more than ever now to actually build the Transcontinental Railroad. And he's going to San Francisco, and he's trying to pitch the idea, and people are starting to call him crazy. He doesn't get the interest that he needs. He doesn't get the backers that he needs. So he actually comes back to Sacramento, and he starts pitching that there could be some easy money made. He switched his pitch. He decided that he wanted to pitch it with an emphasis on quick profit and minimum risk. And indeed, he attracted the big four: Hopkins, Crocker, Huntington, and Stanford. They didn't know a thing about railroads, but they knew a whole lot about business, and they knew a whole lot about money. But they had a bit of a problem. They needed permission from Congress to actually build this railroad. In 1862, Mr. Lincoln, our president at the time, has decided that he is going to back the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act. And effectively, this bill authorized two railroad companies: the Central Pacific Railroad from the west and the Union Pacific Railroad from the east. And they were to commence construction between the two of them, and each was building from its respective starting point. So it was a race, and it was a race to see who could gain the most territory and the largest share of government loans in that particular effort. So the Central Pacific started in Sacramento, as we mentioned, and the Union Pacific started from the Missouri River near Omaha. So the race was on. But here's where the real deal was, if you will: the Treasury loans. Each mile in the flat plains, you would get $16,000. In the Great Basin, which wasn't really our part of the railroad, it was more on the east coming west, was a Great Basin, $32,000. The mountains, you would get $48,000 for each mile, and that was key to our effort. So this is what building the Transcontinental Railroad looked like. This is from the Roseville files, and there weren't unions in those days. It was basically everyone getting together and pulling their teams of horses. Labor came from farmers and anybody else who was available, and they got together to lay these tracks through Roseville. One of my favorite pictures is of the famous Governor Stanford, the locomotive that first traveled this railroad. So Junction was created right here on this map, Central Pacific Railroad. And this is where it crossed the original Sacramento Valley Railroad. And that's where it got the original unique name of Junction. And originally, like I said, it was Gritter's Ranch. Some people call it Grider's Ranch. And that was actually a stagecoach stop. And it happened to be that it also became the junction of the two railroads. And of course, it bloomed into what we knew as Roseville at the time. And here is that junction point right here. The first map of Roseville was laid out in 1864, and it was actually labeled Roseville. We didn't incorporate until many years later, but this was the first map, and we followed it pretty closely through the years. So I want to review a little bit about the money situation. Oops, sorry, I'm on a tight surface here. 16,000 for each mile in the flat plains, 32,000 for each mile in the Great Basin, 48,000 for each mile in the mountains. Well, the tricky thing that happened here in Sacramento, Roseville area, is a surveyor was hired to say that the mountains began 7 miles east of Sacramento. And if you know anything about our topography, you know that that's absolutely not the case. But because that occurred, they were able to pocket a lot more money long term, and they felt that it was a lot more lucrative that way. The Big Four, indeed, pocketed a total of $63 million. They held $100 million worth of stock, and they had power over 9 million acres of land from federal grants. This is why they wanted to build this railroad. It wasn't about the railroad itself. It was for Judah, but not for the Big Four necessarily. I think they may have bought in later on about the whole grand idea of it, but it was all about the money. So they went from Sacramento to Junction, and now they had to get over the pass, the Donner Summit, Sierra Nevada mountains. And to do that, they needed to hire labor. And as you know, they hired hundreds of Chinese workers. They actually recruited them from China, and they came over here to work specifically on the railroad. Prior to the Chinese workers, it was primarily Irish workers. This is outside of the east portal of Tunnel 8, and this is in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And you can see the worker here carrying probably tea or something along those lines to the workers. The biggest obstacle, and it still looks like this today, was called Bloomer Cut. And we didn't get to it until 1865. And this is what provided the rail link between Newcastle and Auburn. This was massive, and they had to do it with primitive hand tools and explosions. One of the managers, Stowbridge, actually lost his eye in one of the explosions, and it was pretty treacherous, hugely treacherous. We removed 40,000 cubic yards of cemented gravel. It's 800 feet long and 65 feet deep at its deepest part. This was a monumental effort. So finally, we're connected. May 10th, 1869. And this connection came at Promontory Point, Utah. Central Pacific won the race. And let's see here. 4 years after this ceremony, the Golden Spike ceremony, the length of the track in the US doubled to over 70,000 miles. In fact, we have more track than we have railroads to use it. A lot of it's been pulled up through the years, but we were a very industrious nation. We were a young nation, and we had a lot of stars in our eyes about the possibilities of railroads. So now virtually the entire country was accessible by rail, and it was making a national economy possible for the first time. Here's another part of the Union Pacific Railroad, and the fellows there posing out in front. Again, here's a reminder of our Transcontinental Railroad. And I said it connected the east to the west. Well, it wasn't quite the east. It was actually more the Midwest to the west. The rest of this was completed, I believe, in 1870. Yes, in August of 1870, the final connection was made. So the journey on the Transcontinental Railroad was not cheap. The fare from Omaha to San Francisco in a third-class sleeping car was about $65 a person. And on June 4th, 1876, a train named the Transcontinental Express arrived in San Francisco 83 hours and 39 minutes after it left New York City. So can you imagine being on the train for 83 hours? 83, 84 hours. The big thing about the economic impact and how these two railroad companies managed their funds is that within 3 years after this was completed, the Union Pacific Railroad filed bankruptcy. And it was a huge scandal at the time. Our big four had some scandal, but they, for the most part, escaped it. But the poor Union Pacific Railroad, they suffered quite a bit, and so did their people. You all recognize this particular picture, I'm sure. It's famous. It's one of the most captivating scenes in history. And a lot of people liken the Transcontinental Railroad to our modern day space program. It really felt like that big of a deal, maybe even more so in connecting the parts of the country that it connected. So here's what you've all been waiting for with the headline of the Golden Spike. There were actually 4 ceremonial spikes. 2 of them were gold and 2 of them were silver. And the gold spikes went to Leland Stanford because his team won. And the silver spikes went to Thomas Durant. He was the leader of the other side. So currently at Stanford University, we have a gold spike and a silver spike there. The second gold spike was lost to time, and the second silver spike is at the Museum of the City of New York. So if you ever want to go visit where those golden spikes are, that's where you can go to visit. The one that was lost to time, they think was part of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, but it hasn't been proven and we'll probably never know. So let's talk about what the railroad and the transcontinental railroads effect are on a small town. And the reason why I like to talk about Roseville and the Transcontinental Railroad and railroads in general is because Roseville pretty much represents what was happening all over the country. I love our story because it's rather unique, it's fun, and I know it pretty well, having been part of the Roseville Historical Society for as long as I was. But the big deal is the railroad initially had settled in Rockland, and it was decided quite a few years later that it was going to be moved to Roseville. And that was a big deal. Prior to 1905, Rockland saw all the action. Rockland saw all the economic prosperity from the railroad. And then in 1905, it was decided that the yards needed to expand. And they were actually considering Loomis and Colfax, even Lincoln, but it was finally decided that Roseville would be the destination. There might have been some backroom deals there, hard to know. So all of a sudden, Roseville became extremely popular, as you can imagine, and we didn't have enough buildings to accommodate everyone, so there was tent cities popping up all over Roseville. And people were moving to Roseville. They moved businesses, they moved houses, they moved every way they could. And it's kind of a big deal now when we see a historic structure being moved, but back in the day, it was no big deal. It was a big deal. It took a lot of effort, but it wasn't uncommon. And to give you an idea of the growth, 1906 to 1909, Look at what's going on. 194 residences are built or are building since 1906. We have 76 business buildings going on, and that's the north side of the tracks. On the south side of the tracks, the old original town, we have 246 residences being built and 37 businesses. Roseville's unique in that it is built on both sides of the railroad tracks. And we saw expansion between 1906 and 1909 on both sides of the railroad tracks. So the railroad is growing and Roseville is growing, and Roseville wants to incorporate, but the railroad is very opposed to incorporation. They actually don't want anything to do with the city because they don't want to pay the taxes or have to answer to anyone. And so there was a big to-do about incorporation. One of the things that I love about the founding fathers of Roseville is they negotiated this. And this was tough. This was a tough negotiation to come to a compromise. So finally, there was an agreement that was drawn up, and it was decided that railroad properties would be totally excluded from incorporation. And that meant meaning local controls or any taxation. And that exists to this day. I don't know how many other cities that's part of, but I'm guessing there's quite a few, if not all of them. However, I will say that the railroad is very involved in Roseville philanthropically, and they are very supportive of a lot of the efforts that go on in town. So here are those founding fathers. 1909, we finally got our incorporation. We became a city. And this famous picture of Mr. Sawtell, Mr. Thiel, Mr. Heyman, of which his house still exists in Roseville, and I'm working diligently to try to get that saved, Mr. Woodbridge, and Mr. Wells. And they were our city's first trustees, and you could call them our first city council. Roseville, as I said, was built on both sides of the railroad tracks. And if you wanted to get from one side of the town to the other, you had to go and cross the railroad when the train wasn't going. And that was quite inconvenient for a very long time. This bridge was built, and it's called the Crooked Bridge. Anybody from Roseville knows the Crooked Bridge or Sierra View Bridge. And this was built, I believe it was 1907-ish. And it was a wooden structure, and it served the city for quite a long time until 1929, when they finally replaced it with a concrete structure. They were a little concerned about fire. But the interesting thing about this original bridge is that it was a community effort. The city really didn't have much to do with it at all. I think it was a local high school shop teacher was instrumental in its design, and the local business people with the wood, and then the building of it, of course, was local labor. But they loved this bridge. We still love this bridge. This was instrumental in helping our town to grow and to be a lot more movable, if you will. The other neat thing about Roseville and the railroad is we originally had the smokestacks of locomotives in the front. That is a normal thing in railroads. However, when you go through the Sierra Nevadas, and there are snow sheds that protect many parts of the railroad from avalanches, the smoke from the stack would blow back and blow onto the engineer here. That was not healthy. It was quite treacherous, and they needed to fix the problem. So they fixed it fairly quickly. And they built what was called a cab forward engine. And this is what's called an articulated Malley. So the cab forward has the engineer in the front, and then the smokestack is behind. And that was a key to our success to getting through the mountains. An articulated Malley was also very important because, as I understand it, and I've never actually viewed one of these personally, but the articulated means hinged. And on the bottom of this locomotive and these cars here, these hinges would allow the railroad, or the rail cars, to go around these corners a lot easier. So the articulated Malley was a big deal. And this cab forward was distinctive to Roseville and to our operations. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is the inside of the blacksmith shop. One of the early pictures. We're not exactly sure when that was taken, but blacksmith shops, of course, were instrumental in keeping the railroad going. The other thing that was unique to Roseville was our artificial ice plant. And we eventually became the largest artificial ice making plant in the world. And the reason this was created was we were shipping produce, and in order for it to be fresh by the time it reached New York, it needed to be iced down. So we built this ice plant. That was built in 1909, and it was actually jointly operated by the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific railroads. And it was a huge, smashing success. In 1913, in fact, the railroad spent an additional $75,000 to expand this Roseville facility. And the expansion continued through the years, and by 1923, that's when we reached the claim of being the world's largest artificial ice plant. We called it the Pacific Fruit Express, and if you've been in Roseville at all, you probably are familiar with PFE Road, which means Pacific Fruit Express. Let's see here. So by July of 1909, the stockyards had been completed. And oh, by the way, all of the shops from Sacramento were actually eventually moved to Roseville, the PFE shops. Let's take a look at what that looks like inside. This is an older picture. The newer ones have a little bit more of our mechanical means in it. This one was still pretty primitive. So the Pacific Fruit Express made us be significant on the map. It helped us grow immensely. Work began, let's see, by February of 1909, we had an ice making capacity of 300 tons per day and a storage capacity of 17,000 tons of ice. Those blocks, by the way, are 300 pound blocks of ice. And they were made in these huge metal containers. And then the ice workers would take the blocks and then they would load them onto what was called reefer cars. And these reefer cars, what I'm told, is that the produce was placed in the back, and then there was a division where the ice was placed in the front. And as the train traveled the tracks, the windows were open, if there were even windows, the wind would blow the coolness from the ice over the produce, and that's how it kept things cool. And I will mention, prior to us having an artificial ice plant, we actually used ice from the ice lakes up in the mountains. There were several places. If anybody's been to Serene Lakes, that's actually that used to be called Ice Lakes. And that was a very popular spot. That's right at Soda Springs. And we loaded a lot of ice in that area. By the way, this is an etching in the trails in downtown Roseville. There's a wonderful etching on the side of the bridge there of this particular image. Also in the background, you see the PFE footbridge, and that's when it was spanning across the tracks. And the citizens of Roseville would use that footbridge to go up and over the tracks so they could actually get into the ice making plant. And fortunately, Roseville has saved that bridge. They moved it, which was kind of hair raising when they moved it, but they moved it and they positioned it over Dry Creek. And again, that's in downtown Roseville. So we've saved this part of our history, which is a wonderful reminder of where we came from. This is our roundhouse, and a wonderful picture of what that looked like. And as I said, we had a lot of agriculture in this area, and the pens for the animals were built, and they loaded them onto the train here in Roseville, also up in Soda Springs. By 1910, Roseville was a major railroad hub, and its population had reached a whopping 2,500 people. So we had grown quite a bit, of course, not even close to our current 140,000, but that was a big deal. We loved our agriculture as well, and we created this wonderful building to actually display all of our locally grown fruits and vegetables so that folks traveling on the railroad could see what the local produce looked like. And we built this in 1915, and it was called the Placer County Exhibit Building. That's an aerial view, and you can see the enormity of what we looked like back in the day. Let's see here. We had by mid 1929, 1,225 men were employed by Roseville Railroad shops. I'm sure there were a few women in there too, and yards. The payroll totaled $186,000. So they were the major employer in town. And by the way, the second major employer in town was Placer County Winery, and that's another story. But between the two businesses, they pretty much employed just about everybody in the area. And by the end of that decade, let's see, we had 6,500 people in Roseville. And of course, the Great Depression hit after that, and that's a whole other story. This is one of my favorite slides, and I threw this in here because we hear sometimes the stories of people repurposing things, specifically railroad cars. And this was a car in 1956 that had been repurposed into a home. One of the other things that was happening with these cars is they would carry workers from one town to the other. And these little cars were made into homes when they did that. And they would simply hook onto the train, go to the next stop, unhook, live there, do what they have to do for their business, and do the same thing all over again. So our Pacific Fruit Express was in operation from 1907 to 1973. And I believe they raised the whole thing by 1974, 75. We can't even really tell it was there unless you know what to look for. But that was a major part, and a lot of people still remember the Pacific Fruit Express and the artificial ice plant. So concluding, the railroad brought a lot of changes, and one of the wonderful things about innovation like this and changes is we realize a lot of new things, just like we do today, we did then. We had our immigrant workers. We had new settlements that occurred all along the Transcontinental Railroad. It was an enormous amount of hope and excitement for a young nation. And if any of you belong to newspapers.com, pull up some of those older newspapers and read about the excitement that was coming to this nation and all the possibilities that were finally presented to the minds that hadn't been presented before. We connected communities like never before. And of course, it was an innovation, just like the space program is innovation now and when it was in the 60s and 70s, et cetera. The Transcontinental Railroad and railroads in general were just a mainstay of innovation. And of course, it expanded global commerce. So the railroad stitched the country together. And as the track was laid, there was farming, there was town building, and there was industry. It was all made available. And I love that part about the history. And the other side of the story, of course, is we can think very joyfully about our accomplishments. And at the same time, we're obligated to think about the painful questions, right? And that's a whole other presentation. But some things to think about is how much of pristine nature should we conquer? And of course, our Native Americans had absolutely no say in how their centuries-old societies and their lives would be lived in the aftermath. And there's a lot to that story. But I like to conclude with the joyful part of it. And it was a quick presentation. I do tend to talk quickly. So I would love to open it up and have us all contribute and ask questions. And I will change my view here so I can see all of you. And Mary Ellen, you're still with us, yay.
I'm still here. And Christina, if you will stop share your screen so we can just see you full face.
How's that? No? Oh,
Nope,
stop
nope.
share. Okay.
Stop share.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
So Christina, thank you so much. And I'm going to thank you for being brief. Kathy is very excited too. We are trying to do more of these history talks in under an hour, although we can be here longer. I do have some questions that are in the chat. We are going to invite you to start your videos, but not your audio unless you put your hand up. There is a new process in Zoom where if you do put your hand up to talk, Kathy's going to go by and make sure that she does an invitation for you to start the video just in case you have some problems. So here's the first question, and I might actually ask Christine a question as well. She said, my husband's great-grandfather was working on the Transcontinental Railroad and was at the Golden Spike ceremony. His family has looked for historical documents listing all the workers, but haven't found anything with his name. Is there a website where someone has compiled all the names of the workers on the various parts of the railroad?
Oh, what a wonderful story and what a wonderful history and how fun that has to be. So a couple of things. Go back to the newspapers, like I said, newspapers.com, and do a search on your ancestor's name. I don't know a particular website, and if someone else does, please let me know. But I do know that the Railroad Museum in Sacramento is a wonderful resource for a lot of things. And I'm guessing if you start there, they'll minimally be able to point you in the right direction.
And if I might mention, Bill George, who's both a rail historian and filmmaker, is with us. And so, Bill, if you know the answer to that, if you can chime in as well. I will give you one other source, and that is Hathy Trust, Hathi. What is that called? Not the bottom thing, not the underscore, dash trust, trust.org. It is full text of millions of documents. And so oftentimes people who wrote papers or whatever that is not on the web might have written papers and compiled that kind of list. So take a look at Hathy Trust as well.
And Bill, thank you.
Okay, here's our next question. This is
okay,
Chris.
Mary Ellen, Bill is talking. I think he's on mute.
Oh, okay. So let me go to
Bill, unmute yourself. There you are.
There I am. So
great. Thank you, Bill.
As Christina said, there's two railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. So any records for workers will be at the Union Pacific Railroad. They have a great archive. It's in Omaha. You can go there. The Central Pacific has not all, but has many payroll records of workers, including Chinese workers who worked on the railroad. And you can get those at the Railroad Museum here in Sacramento. So those are the two main places to go for those records.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So we have a question from Chris. What happened to Theodore Judah?
Thank you for asking that. And that was something I should have touched upon. So Theodore Judah became disillusioned with the Big Four, and he wanted to break off from them. And he had struck a deal with them, and I believe it was 1862, and Bill, you can confirm or deny. And he had, I believe, a settlement of $100,000. And he was going back east, traveling back east with Anna, his wife, to create a new deal with Congress. And he caught yellow fever and died en route. So he was basically, that problem was eliminated for the Big Four. But Theodore Judah was a wonderful part of our transcontinental history. And I do believe the Sacramento Historical Society will be doing a presentation about him, probably within the next year.
Great, thank you. And now we have a question that if you, I'm not saying you're not going to be able to answer this, but if Bill needs to jump in, and I know that Tony Gain is in the room and quite a few docents at the California State Railroad Museum, and that is, do you know the names of the dignitaries who were posing or shaking hands in the photos. And that's from Luann Hoffman. Thank you, Luann, for coming from outside Austin, Texas.
I don't know them off the top of my head. Bill, do you know them off the top of your head?
No, but again, if you go to the Railroad Museum in Sacramento, there's a beautiful
Yes.
mural, I guess, of that, and they have all the names in there. You can see every name put up on the wall right by their picture, so you can see who they all are.
Good. And now we have from Paolo, is the north and south tracks in Roseville, Vernon and Atlantic streets?
Not Vernon, it would be Atlantic and Pacific. So Vernon and Atlantic are on the same side, right? And then that's the east side, and or which side would that be? South? I call it east and west. And then Pacific Street is the other side. So when the Transcontinental Railroad came through, they actually moved Atlantic Street 100 yards back. So the Atlantic Street that you see now in Roseville is not the original Atlantic Street. Imagine that Roseville was actually another 100 yards into the rail yards. And it was, what you're seeing now is kind of a makeshift of the alley that existed there. It was quite altered when the Transcontinental came through.
And Tony, I'm assuming it was Tony that said there's a huge cab forward engine in the California State Railroad Museum that everybody can take a look at.
Thank you.
I have a question, and that is that when the shops closed, which was what, in Sacramento, 1995, a little bit about that time, about 400 workers I found actually went to Roseville. So how active is Roseville now? You said at one point there were 2,500 workers. How many workers are still currently working for the railroad in Roseville today?
I don't know the exact number. I know that they are no longer, I don't even think they're in our top 10 of employment any longer. A lot of those workers were replaced by innovation, mechanics, people were replaced with machines, if you will. Things were improved. Bill, do you know about how many people in Roseville?
Last I saw, there was that's between 1,000 and 2,000 people there.
Okay.
A lot of them got moved to Nebraska, where the Union Pacific has a major facility there. Most of them are there now.
And then again, this is an oddball question because I feel like I grew up at the Roseville Denials auction.
Oh yeah.
And the livestock auction as well. Did that come into being into places like that because of the railroad? Because they could literally just ship if it was purchased or off? Did Denials have anything to do with the railroads at all, or?
Everything had something to do with the railroad in early Roseville, and Denials was the auction yard. So that's where you could go to buy and sell your cattle, your horses. Of course, it's evolved since then, but absolutely the two were tied together.
All right, I have an Amtrak question.
Uh-oh.
I just recently snuck off in October to go to Colorado, and we passed by on the California Zephyr Roseville. It's actually a stopping station.
Yeah.
But you can only do it once a day, and you can't come back that same night because obviously the California Zephyr. Was there a time when the route from Sacramento to Roseville and up into Newcastle, Auburn was a commuter where you could actually go up by day, come back, or multiple, or was it one of the other lines?
I'm really glad Bill is with us.
I'm asking some of these because I know Bill can answer some of them.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. What was it?
Was there ever a commuter, where we could actually go from Sacramento to Roseville using, the rail lines as
Absolutely. That's it. Yeah, passenger traffic was very important to them in the early days, as was freight. So both, but they had a whole schedule. You can find that schedule probably online, but the old schedule, but it was every 15 minutes or so would stop and pick people up, and then transfer. They had stagecoaches that would come meet at transfer,
Yeah.
And then other rail lines that would feed into it. So yeah, it was quite the commuter railroad for a while.
Great, good. And Janet, I'm hoping it's just Bollinger, has for a wonderful book on the Chinese railroad workers, check out Ghosts of Gold Mountain by Gordon Chang. I might mention that he and David Suhu are considering being guest speakers in the fall for us on exactly that topic. So if you haven't picked up Gordon Chang's books, you really should. Vern asks, would you comment on the agreement for the companies to meet at Promontory Point?
Comment on the agreement for the Railroad Act?
Yeah, that's a question from Vern.
It was a race to see who would get finished first. I'm not really sure what more I would comment on.
Well, as they got close to meeting, so they would meet, right? And they're actually offline for quite a bit. And then they kind of had informal negotiations about where each one would end, because remember, they were getting paid by the mile. So they wanted to get as many miles as they could. But as they got close to the end, they kind of worked out where they'd meet exactly. But it was never predetermined exactly where they would meet, because they didn't really know. They were just, and for a while, actually, they kind of passed each other, but that's another story.
That is another story. Yeah.
I understand.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
If I might comment, I understand that for quite some distance, they were actually laying tracks side by side.
Yes.
Because there was no agreement
Right.
for them to actually meet. And so there had to be an act of Congress to tell them where they were going to meet. And so they agreed on Promontory Point, because as you pointed out, they were getting money for the distance of the track. And so the more track they could lay, the more money they could make.
This is why I love dialogue with the audience.
I might mention that we do have other talks about the railroad that should be on or will be on with the training tomorrow. I'm going to get from Kathy Hart on our YouTube channel. And I don't know if Kathy can actually unplug and tell us how to get to the YouTube channel, but Norv Wellsfree did a wonderful talk on the railroads of Lake Tahoe that was recorded and should be posted. We do have last season's Dining on the Rail, which is different than Maryland Summerdorf's, that the Alter Egos, a group of Renaissance storytellers, told, that are some really tremendous stories. So look for that site. Hopefully I will get my training tomorrow and get those on as well. I'm going to ask again, if there's any more questions, if people could in the chat, those of you that are not Renaissance members or that have high interest in other railroad stories, if you would let us know if that's something. I'm going to invite Bill George, who speaks on any number of subjects, to join us for talks. So Bill, this is an invitation for you to start doing talks for the Renaissance Society.
Thank you.
Yes, am I right? And I hope that the Sacramento Historical Society starts partnering with us on all of these. And if we have others of you that are in the audience tonight that would like to present either, am I right, Kathy? I'm going to let you do the plug for bits and pieces, what you're hoping for, or a longer program, we'd like to invite you to let us know.
Okay, I'm actually typing in Renaissance Cafe YouTube, so I want to get that in the chat so folks can see the recordings for all of the, all the public events that Renaissance Society does with our partners. That will be on our Renaissance Cafe. So let me get that in there while I've got the link. Okay, just posted it. Yes, bits and pieces are a lot of hands-on things. It's really, I would say, more art related, some writing topics, not really history. For example, I'm doing one in March that's going to explain how to make chocolate truffles just in time for Easter. So lots of interesting things, but we will be working very diligently on this website. If you signed up on Eventbrite, follow the organizer, because it's all going to be under that organizer, and then you can see the various events. But this YouTube channel will have everything that we can get uploaded to YouTube that's for the public and not just specifically for Renaissance Society members. That's going to be on our YouTube, and I just posted it in chat.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I will also announce, and it might not be till summer, but the Society for the Preservation of Carter Railroad Resources down in Ardenwood Historic Farm. And I don't know if anybody's had an opportunity to visit it. It's in Fremont or Newark, I always forget which one, 270-acre working farm that also has a horse-drawn train that you can experience. And they are offering wonderful talks about the actual trolley system as well that are using it. So we are going to have more. I really want to thank Christina for doing this talk. And so if we can all thank her very, very much, I'm going to stop the recording and then ask people to continue to stay with us because I know some of you are just too shy to join in the conversation. So thank you.
Mary Ellen, Tom has